Thank you, Chairman. I would like to, on behalf of Attorney General Kilmartin, thank Speaker Mattiello for putting in this important legislation. I would also like to thank Danica Iokoi for speaking on the bill tonight, and I would like to introduce Sue Coutu, who is Kristen Coutu's mother, and Jim Baum, the Deputy Chief of our Criminal Division, who handled the case of State versus Aaron Andrade. Aaron Andrade was indicted on first-degree murder for the death of Kristen Coutu. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 40 years, 20 years to serve. To answer Representative Knight's questions, there are many charging mechanisms that the Attorney General's office can use in this case. The problem with overdose deaths is that they're very fact-specific, and it might not fit all cases. And we're in the middle of an opiate crisis. Not are we just in the middle of an opiate crisis, we're in the middle of an opiate crisis involving synthetic opioids that are 10 to 100 times stronger than their counterparts, that people are cutting with other agents, making them false stamped, and selling them, saying they're heroin or fentanyl when they're really taking someone to their death. And they're so strong that Narcan cannot reverse them. We wrote this law to ensure that the people making money off of this drug will be held accountable, no matter the factual situation, if there is proximate cause or cause that their delivery of that drug killed the person who ingested it. Because overdose deaths are not about the drug dealer, they're not about the addiction, they're about the victim of the overdose. And law enforcement nationally, over the last 5 years, Jim trains nationally on this issue, has now made an overdose scene a crime scene because of the opiate crisis. So no longer do we go in as first responders and deal with the victim that is there deceased or struggling. We treat it as a crime scene because a crime most likely happened, because someone put that drug in that person's hand and it caused their death. We very much understand that this bill needs amendments. The Attorney General is interested in going after only drug dealers. In no way do we want to prosecute those that share drugs. We do support an up-to-life amendment to this bill, but be clear. The people that are selling these synthetic drugs in our state know exactly what they're selling. And they're selling it for a profit margin that you won't believe until Mr. Baum tells you about it tonight. So the Attorney General is in great support of this bill. The Center for Disease Control has actually said that because of this prescription opiate knockoffs that are occurring from them, that's what's actually leading to the overdose crisis. We think this bill needs to be considered seriously, and we look forward to working with the Speaker, to you, Chair, and the committee on a bill that holds everyone accountable, but also protects those that are suffering from substance use disorders.
Thank you, Joey. Representative Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How would the Attorney General object, or did you guys think about perhaps narrowing the bill a little bit to include some of the substances that we're particularly trying to get at? So, someone who delivers or otherwise a felony, injection or orally takes one of these super powerful synthetic opioids, and making the bill more targeted at that particular crime. Because my concern with the bill, I don't have a problem with the concept, obviously, but my concern with the bill is a little overbroad, and then we put it into law, and 50 years down the road with another Attorney General, I worry about discretionary decisions on the part of the government. I mean, the whole point of our criminal law is that it's supposed to be very specific so that prosecuting authority can't engage in overreach, which there have been times in our past nationally that's happened. So I'm wondering if there might be a little room to narrow it through. And I don't know if you did or not, and I'm just asking the question.
I would address that in several ways. We have certainly talked about it. I think that Jim and I can both attest to how much thought went into this bill. And we wrote the bill the way we did for several reasons. One, delivery of a drug is currently felony murder. It doesn't depend the drug. It hasn't depended the drug in common law. So why would we put a bill in now that actually minimalizes what is essentially felony murder, depending on the factual scenario. The other reason is that the General Assembly in the early 90s put this bill on the books because a mother gave her, I believe, daughter Suboxone to treat a flu, and she died. And that's why this bill is actually on the books. So we read the one-sided case regarding that, and the court actually said, and I'm not going to get the language right, but the court actually said, you know, we defer second-degree murder in this case, but the General Assembly has spoke to this and spoke to death and drugs together by creating 1123-6, and that's why this bill in this case is important. So I would say, have we thought about it? Yes. Will we continue to talk about it? Yes. But I don't think that narrowing the drug class in this bill is the part of the bill that needs narrowing, especially when we're not narrowing it in the common law. I think the scenario that Representative O'Grady, while you could stretch it out to that 180-degree angle, is certainly not anything that would meet a causation element that we would have to prove. My concern with limiting the drugs is whose deaths are we taking more into account for? I don't want to look at a victim where the facts are clearly there and say, well, it was cocaine, so we're not going to charge. I don't think that's fair. And I think that you would know, Representative Knight, that these cases are extremely hard to prove. The causation between the drug dealer's sale and the user's take of the drug is incredibly complicated, to the fact that I believe that Kristen's case is the only case our office has charged since the early 90s. So this is not a case that gets charged often. It's incredibly difficult.
Vice Chairwoman Agello.
Joey, my question is regarding your use of the word, you're treating these scenes as a crime scene. A couple of years ago, we passed legislation protecting an individual present at the scene of an overdose from being prosecuted for being at the scene of the overdose and around possession of drugs. Does that change, has that changed at all?
Not at all, Vice Chairwoman. I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think that that's something that needs to be talked about with this bill as well. Law enforcement is well trained about the Good Samaritan protections and very much respect that. We file a report with the General Assembly every January. I think 85 incidences weren't charged last year in Good Samaritan. When I say we treat it as a crime scene, law enforcement's treating it as a homicide scene, where there's a death. And we've been actually working with the U.S. Attorney's Office to give law enforcement palm cards, not to go in and charge anyone, but to preserve the scene, to make sure there wasn't any wrongdoing by a sale or a delivery, while still taking into the protections of the Good Samaritan Act. We in no way in this bill want to trample Good Samaritan, and that is something that if we need to put in the bill as well, we've been looking at as well. But when I say crime scene, I mean homicide death scene.
Representative O'Grady.
Can you tell me what the penalty is now, or the potential penalty is now for, this bill seems to be making it life imprisonment, but what is the potential penalty now for someone who sells a controlled substance to someone who dies as a result of ingestion?
If it fits felony murder, it's first-degree murder, mandatory life.
And what would constitute fitting felony murder?
If you could prove, so felony murder is a death occurs in the execution of a felony,
Okay.
which is very similar to a drug dealing death, which I would call this, it's DUI, death delivery death. But there's very certain facts that could change that equation pretty quickly, which is why a bill like this is necessary.
So do you need to prove that the dealer intended to kill somebody? Is that at all part of the scenario?
You need to prove, and I'll let Jim talk to this because he's much more up to speed on this than I am. You don't have to prove intent to kill, you have to prove intent to deliver. And causation after that.
So the only thing this is doing is making it a mandatory life sentence.
Which it already is under first-degree murder, other than there's certain fact patterns that might not fit that felony murder position.
All right, thank you.
Representative Knight.
I just think for the benefit of the committee and actually everyone in the room, and Jim, help me out here if I get this wrong. I think felony murder is you have a felony, and then the death results, and there's causation, and the key is reasonable and foreseeable as a result of the commission of the felony. Does that?
It's during the course of an enumerated felony, and in this case would be the distribution of a controlled substance. If someone dies during the course of that enumerated felony. Also, felony murder is during the course of a robbery, a bank robbery. The assailant runs out of the bank, the gun falls out of the pocket, the gun goes off, it shoots and kills a guard. That person had no intent to kill the guard, but he is still liable under the felony murder statute.
That's the classic example, right?
And in the case of Kristen's case with the defendant Aaron Andrade,
Talking to the mic. Yeah.
can you hear me?
There you go.
In the
Talking
case
to
of
it. There you
Aaron
go.
Andrade, the predicate or underlying felony was the sale and distribution of a controlled substance, but it was a death during the course of a sale or distribution. This bill makes it a little clearer. It says that if a death results from a sale or distribution, it is murder. So there's no causational leap that we had in the case of Aaron Andrade. It makes it clear, and it sends a clearer message to drug dealers and distributors out there that it will be considered murder.
So if you had, may I, Mr. Chairman, one more? So if you had, and I don't want to get all technical, but just bear with me for one hypo. If you had a guy who's selling heroin, right, laced with, it's got the fentanyl in it. So we know that if somebody takes it, it's going to be bad. That person sells it. The person, let's say he sells it, we make it easy. He sells it directly to a person. They walk away. An hour later, they ingest the drug and they die. And that person's caught by law enforcement and charged. Could you charge that guy felony murder?
We did. We charged Aaron Andrade with felony murder because the facts in Kristen's case was very similar. Kristen ordered what she thought was heroin, and she had an addiction that she was trying to control, and Sue will talk to it, to Kristen's
Yes,
story.
but there is-
She ordered up that one hit of heroin, and it ended up being 100% fentanyl. And she died within seconds of injecting herself. She died in the car that she was found in. And we charged Aaron Andrade with 2 theories of murder, felony murder, the predicate felony being during the course of a distribution of controlled substance. We also proceeded under a second-degree reckless indifference to the sanctity of human life theory.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any further questions for the Attorney General's office? Yes, Rep. Almeida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir,
Yes, sir.
I'm reading all these different issues for and against, trying to be wide open over here. With the cocaine, crack, heroin issue that we had back in the day, to me, it almost seems like deja vu reading this bill. With the war on drugs back in the day, it still makes you kind of wonder, did it really work? That being said and done, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're saying this bill will send a clear message to drug dealers? Are you saying this will really work? That this is going to help fill our prisons with more of these terrible people that dealt these drugs? So are you telling me that it's going to work?
Yeah, many states in the wake of the crack and heroin epidemic passed similar statutes to this. And a lot of what we're seeing now in the wave of the opioid epidemic, we're seeing those states actually add to that legislation, and other states joining and proposing what we're joining as well. Just from my perspective and what I'm offering you, if it could help in your deliberations, the public health side of this war against the opioid overdose epidemic is incredibly crucial. The first responder side is incredibly crucial, and it's essential. But there's also that law enforcement side, and what can we do as members of law enforcement to try to attack not only the supply, but the demand? And in this case, the overdose deaths in the crack epidemic in the 90s and the heroin epidemic of the 80s pales in comparison to the opioid overdose epidemic. You're looking at substances that are 100 times more powerful than morphine, that they are lethal. And it's becoming a question of lethality. And in a state like Rhode Island, where everybody knows everybody in this state, a law that is clearly designed to send a message to drug dealers that if you're going to peddle incredibly lethal material, you are going to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And so what we do on the law enforcement side works in complement to what's being done on the public health side.
Representative Price?
Wait a minute.
Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Almeida.
So, you said pales to the crack era to this present date. Unfortunately, what happened to your daughter is awful that you all got to be here today. And my condolences go out to you in this. And I really do mean that. But when you're up here as a legislator, you try to figure out how to weigh everything that you've seen in the past, the present, to today. So you said pales. To me, a death is a death, whether it's back in the 70s
I agree.
or today. I just need to be convinced. Actually, I think it's a good issue. This is a good bill. But it needs to be twisted, turned around, especially with the Good Samaritan factor in it. That needs to be protected. Okay. I have a big issue, and everybody up here knows it, with that word discretion by a judge. Because it may not always work all the time, and it may not be consistent. So I ask that you look at this a little bit further in the protection of the Good Samaritan bill. And I ask that you look at the word discretion, because the pale that you're talking about is still the same. Somebody passed away in the 70s. Somebody passed away this time around again. And we were told back then, like we're being told now, oh, this will lock them up. This will scare the drug dealers. No, it didn't. No, it didn't. But should they be scared? Should they be going to prison? Yeah, you take a life, it is what it is. I don't have a question for you. It's just a statement of concern. And I ask that you look at this a little bit deeper, especially sitting next to her mama right there.
I'll address one point that you brought up with respect to the Good Samaritan. I believe Joey responded to that, and that we are working to alter the language to take into consideration the Good Samaritan. And when I used the word pales in comparison, I was responding to your comparison of that epidemic to what's going on now.
That's fair.
When you're dealing with numbers of 2015 where 60,000 Americans died, that's more than all of the fatalities in the Vietnam War. That is a significant number. It is a significant amount of people nationwide passing away. In 2015 in Rhode Island, the deaths with respect to opioid overdose outnumbered motor vehicles, suicides, homicides, and violent crimes combined. In 2016, out of 336 overdose deaths, 195 or 58% involved fentanyl alone. In 2017, the total number of overdoses went down to 314, but 199 or 63.4% involved fentanyl. So those numbers are alarming. And this state did not pass similar legislation back in the crack and heroin epidemic days. It's time to pass it now. It's time to tool law enforcement to respond in the way it can.
We shall see.
Representative Roberts, would you like your votes recorded? And Whip Edwards, would you like your votes recorded? Yes, Chairman. Representative Knight.
It's not a question, but Jim, I don't think we formally introduced you to the committee, and
I'm going to give Jim an opportunity to add testimony in a second, but I don't know if you wanted to continue the line of questioning.
No, I just wanted the committee to know who Jim is and his
Okay.
role at the AG's office.
Thanks.
Yes. So Ms. Lindbeck had to leave to testify in another committee, and Jim very graciously hopped in to answer some questions that were directed to the Attorney General's office. Jim, did you want to add any testimony
Just
of your
briefly,
own?
Chairman, I want to thank the committee for allowing me the opportunity to sit beside Sue Coutu, first of all, and to just give whatever experience I can to help you in your deliberations on what we think is a very important bill. We covered most of I think, the salient questions that have been raised. I can say that I have worked with the National Association of Attorney Generals and have served on their faculty nationwide in training law enforcement professionals as well as prosecutors. And this issue is nationwide. I'm sorry. My name is Jim Baum. I'm the Deputy Chief of the Criminal Division. I have served at the Attorney General's office as the Chief of the Narcotics and Organized Crime Unit for 3 years. I've also served as chief of the juvenile unit, and I've been and still am a line prosecutor prosecuting mostly felony cases. In my training with NAG, I've trained law enforcement investigators as well as prosecutors on this very issue on opioid overdose. These are incredibly complex cases to investigate as a police officer and to train an investigatory professional. And we provide assistance. And we're trying to do that in a uniform way here in Rhode Island as well. We're also training prosecutors and learning from prosecutors countrywide as to how they're addressing this from the law enforcement side. Many of the states have legislation allowing their prosecutors and their law enforcement professionals to charge these kind of cases as murders. Other cases, other states do not, and I know they're in the process of trying to pass similar legislation. All of those and all the professionals involved in law enforcement want a clear message with a law like this that sends that notice to drug dealers and distributors that their actions in distributing lethal substances is murder. It's lethal. Joey touched on the profitability, and I'll just say this, and I'll allow Sue to speak. Generally on the street, a kilo of fentanyl is worth $7,000. Now, I brought for the committee, I have packages here if the committee wants, just an image of what a lethal dose of fentanyl looks like and how big that is. One of the major issues that we have in Rhode Island as well as Ohio and in New Hampshire and Connecticut and Massachusetts, and the list goes on and on and on, is counterfeit opioid pills, masking as legitimate opioid, oxycodone, and the like. Those pills are being made in basements by would-be chemists and distributors, and they mix fentanyl along with other materials to make these pills. There's no quality control in those. Those pills go out to the consumer on the street, and they buy those pills, and it could be Russian roulette with the lethality of that substance. One granule of fentanyl off from that amount, and it's death. So $7,000 is generally the street price for a kilo of fentanyl. And it's not surprising that fentanyl is increasing in its availability, especially that China is flooding the market here in the United States, as well as Canada, as well as Mexico. And just recently, the DEA uncovered a lab in Sinaloa, Mexico, connected to the Sinaloa cartel. That lab is now manufacturing fentanyl. That's right across our border. So the supply is increasing. Heroin, subject to the seasons, if it's a warm season or cold season, fluctuates in price. Fentanyl does not. It's $7,000 a kilo. If that kilo is then cut up and made using 1 milligram of fentanyl per pill, and those pills are sold for $20 a pill, that kilo can get a would-be drug dealer from Pawtucket or Central Falls or Coventry or wherever that they have a pill press, $20 million. That's the price, that's the profit margin of this new wave of lethal drugs. And that's why, as far as law enforcement, we would like the tools to respond to that situation. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Jim from the Attorney General's office? Representative Craven, would you like your votes recorded?
Please, thank you. Jim, welcome. It's an honor to have you here. One of the smartest guys that I've ever had an opportunity to have contact with in the Attorney General's office.
It's an honor to be here.
I attended a lecture last Friday at the Department of Health in reference to this very subject matter. And I was told by the head chemist over there that there's a new synthetic type drug that purports to be fentanyl synthetic style, and that comparison to street fentanyl and synthetic fentanyl, that it was even some ridiculous number, like 1,000 times less, that the synthetic fentanyl presence in a pill or a cigarette or a shot of heroin would, and if it was 1 gram more, which that's how small they were talking about, it would kill you before you hit the floor.
Right.
Is that the case?
Yes, it is. There's a substance called carfentanil, and it's in the packet that I made for the committee. Carfentanil is 100 times more potent than fentanyl. Again, fentanyl, this much fentanyl results in, that's a lethal dose of fentanyl. In the case of carfentanil, it's like 3 grains of salt. And these substances are all made in the lab, and so it's akin to the synthetic cannabinoids and synthetic cathinones that a chemist wants to change the organic compound and make it more and more potent so you can cut it more and more to make more and more money, they're going to get more and more potent. These are lethal substances.
Well, you know, Jim, I've said this in the past in reference to legislation that we've considered up here to address this opioid epidemic, that given the numbers, and I don't think that numbers really necessarily the best measurement by measuring how big a problem this is, but when you're talking over 350 people that die from this a year, if it were a disease, say borne by a mosquito, we would have the Center for Disease Control up here with hazmat suits on trying to stomp out this mosquito population. We need to look at this as a health crisis, and I appreciate that you guys at the Attorney General's office are taking this real seriously. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Craven. Any further questions? Representative Price.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, from what you're telling me, this seems like a real serious epidemic. It's actually people delivering substances that are killing people, is what I'm getting at. So have you guys looked at what the federal government has proposed as far as addressing the opioid crisis?
With respect to this legislation, no. We did not look to what the federal government is doing. We looked to other states and what their experiences have been, and that's the basis of this law.
Right, because I know they're talking about stricter penalties, and I mean, even if I mean, have you guys considered like the death penalty for killing someone else with this fentanyl product?
No, we have not. No.
Would they consider that? Would the Attorney General consider that?
I don't think.
I mean-
I think that, as Joey said, we're talking about what the ultimate penalty would be, and would it be whether it's life or up to life. Up to life would give the courts discretion in sentencing, and it would give a little bit of leeway with respect to the sentencing in a case-by-case basis. These cases are very different. Each one of them are very different.
Right, I understand they're hard to prosecute, and
Right.
I understand that, but it certainly is. I mean, people are obviously, you know, killing people with these drugs, so it's a certainly needs to be addressed, you know, in a hard manner.
I agree.
So, but thank you.
You're welcome.
Any further questions for Jim? Yes, Representative Almeida.
I'm all done after this. I don't want to tie up the basketball game. You said you sat down with law enforcement, Attorney General's office. That's good. Was anybody nationally, other national organizations like a public defender, people from the community, anybody else sat down at this think table to decide how this is going to go forward?
With respect to the legislation,
Yeah.
we sat down with members of the community. Obviously,
Rhode Island?
In Rhode Island, victims groups. We talked with the victims groups, and we drafted what we thought was the most straightforward piece of legislation there was.
So, can you name me some organizations you sat down with?
Victims organizations like Ms. Coutu and other survivors, and our office.
So you don't know their names off the top of your head, but you're saying folks under the victims group sat with you
Right.
all.
We reached out to other law enforcement agencies.
Other than law enforcement, that's what I'm asking for. Who from the community sat down at the table?
I don't know if Joey reached out to anybody else, but that's all I know.
Okay, that's fair to you. Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, Vice Chair McEntee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering what other efforts, I think this is a good bill, but what other efforts are being made by law enforcement and the Attorney General to stop people from making these drugs or from getting them into the state, period? I mean, it seems to me you got to catch it
Right.
at the source. I mean, this is we're going almost a little backwards, but it's definitely a way to go about it. I'm not against it, so. But what can we do to get at the source and stop it from being manufactured and brought into the state?
So again, this bill is part of a bigger picture. It's a part of a public health picture that's combating the opioid overdose epidemic. But we are also using traditional law enforcement tools to get inside of these drug distribution organizations to make traditional arrests with respect to street-level drug distribution, long-term investigations partnering with the Department of the Drug Enforcement Agency and the ATF. So we're actively working with our federal partners and local partners to investigate these rings and try to get to the source of these drugs. It's incredibly hard to do that when you have drugs coming in from Mexico, now being manufactured in Mexico, as well as Canada, and drugs that are being flooded into this country through China. But the DEA is very proactive in trying to narrow and target areas in China where this is coming from. And I know in Ohio, one of my partners in Ohio, they actually had a long-term investigation that was directed to one facility in China that rolled into a DEA investigation. So it's traditional law enforcement investigation. Thank you. You're welcome.